Hello, my name is Adam Elliot and I'm an animation writer and director, and I live here in Melbourne, and today I'm going to talk to you about how I make my films, but more importantly, why I make my films. My style of animation has various terms. Most commonly it's called stop motion animation. Another term is claymation. I've actually invented my own term, and that is what I make are what's called clayographies, which is clay animated biographies. And I'm thinking of getting that word trademarked. But it really is very apt because it is, what I do is an amalgamation of different things. I tell biographies that are animated that just happen to be in plasticine. And everything in my films, every prop, every set, every character is a real tangible object. The skies are real painted canvases, rain, we use a fishing line, fire is red cellophane. So we can confidently say to the audience when they see an Adam Elliot film that what they're seeing is 100% made in camera in a traditional manner, and that every prop, set and character that they see has been handcrafted. Well, there's a few reasons I choose stop motion animation over CGI, and the main reason is because I like using my hands. We do use computers for editing and sound and other bits and pieces, and they do assist what we do, but the bulk of what we do is with our hands. And very early on in my career I realised that I could never be a computer animator because sitting in front of a computer screen all day for me would be very frustrating. I'd have to, I have to get paint on my fingers. I love using glue and wood and metal and rubber, and to me it's a very almost primeval way of making art. And the other great thing about stop motion is that on my films I've been able to employ people who share my passion and who are like-minded, and we are a rare breed. And it's great working with other people who also like getting their hands dirty. You can do 2D animation, 3D animation, you can animate sand, there's all sorts of ways to animate. But really, at the end of the day, it's the story that's the most important thing. With all my films, I've always said that I've never been obsessed by their length. Because my films are biographies, I always let the characters tell me how long their stories should be. My first 4 films were all shorts. The first was Uncle, then Cousin, then Brother, and they were all roughly about 5 minutes in length. They each took about a year to make. And after I'd made those 3, I thought, well, I feel like I want to explore a biography that's a bit longer, a bit more challenging. So that's when we decided to pursue Harvey Crumpet. And Harvey ended up telling us that his story should be about 23 minutes, which was a perfect commercial half hour for SBS television. I'd always focused on one character, and I thought, well, it's time I really sort of explored multiple characters, and that's when we decided to make Mary Max. And Mary Max is still biographical, but it's really about 2 lead characters. And when I sat down to write that, I wasn't sure if it was going to be feature length. I knew it was definitely more than a half hour. But luckily, once I started writing, and I'd never written a feature, but once I'd started writing, I realised that this was almost of epic proportions, and if anything, we had too much to tell. So we pared it back to about 90 minutes, which again is a perfect length for animation. For some reason, animation that's over 100 minutes becomes a bit intolerable. I think once you've suspended your disbelief for that amount of time in animation, it doesn't work. So most animated features are generally under 100 minutes. Once the storyboard and the script are what we call locked off, we then move into a very intense pre-production stage. And on Mary and Max, that took about 6 to 8 months. And that's where we really planned the aesthetic to the film, how detailed we could go with the sets and props, and really worked out all the logistics. And that's also the period where we set up the studio, decided upon which cameras we were going to use, started to employ all the artists, all the camera department, of course the animators, and getting our crew together. And so it's a very intense scary period because that's your chance to get everything prescribed, because once you start shooting you have to be absolutely ready. In Australia we have wonderful crews who are very multi-skilled, and so in our pre-production period people who were the head sculptors were also building props and sets, and it was a very, I often say I wasn't the director of the film, I was the ringmaster of the circus, and those first 6 months were very, controlled chaos and slightly out of control, but we got there in the end. Once we started shooting Mary and Max, things really started to become streamlined, and my day became very predictable. I was always first to arrive at around 7 a.m. and generally last to leave at about 8 in the evening. I ended up working 7 days a week, extremely long hours, but really I had to, because I was the director of the film and I suppose the conductor of the orchestra, the ringmaster of the circus, so the buck ended with me. Nick Park, the director of all the Aardman features, Chicken Run and Wallace and Gromit and those sorts of features, he said many years ago in a documentary that being a director on a stop motion animated film is like being creative with a gun at your head. Everything is pressurised and you have to make snap decisions, and sometimes you make the wrong decisions. But generally you just got to go with your gut instinct. Luckily Mary Max was all in my head. I'd memorised the whole script virtually, and these characters were very real people to me, so in a way they directed themselves. With animated films, usually you get the actors in right up front. You record their voices and then you work out how long each shot's going to be, and you mould the characters around the voice. But because my films are driven by narration, it meant that we had the luxury of getting some of the actors in later. And it really depended on what the actor what character the actor was playing. So for Barry Humphries, who was our narrator, he wasn't a character, he was just this anonymous voice. So we really could have got Barry in at any time. So we decided to get him in early, and that was good, but we also got him in the middle and we also got him in at the end. With the other actors, Philip Seymour Hoffman, we would have loved to have got him in the early stages, but of course he's a very in-demand actor, and of course living in another country. And it took us a year just to get him to agree to say yes, he would do the film. He'd never done an animated film before, he'd never heard of me, but once we got him the script, which took a year just to get him the script, once he read the script he said yes. And then to record him, we couldn't afford to fly him out from America, so we actually recorded him remotely in New York. So we had a sound studio there, a sound studio here, and via a very expensive cable hookup we recorded him remotely. It's very, very difficult to record your actor when they're in another country. The irony is I've never met Philip Seymour Hoffman, but we spent 2 very long days together and we feel like we've met each other. We both find it a bit odd that we still haven't met. So we got Philip in at the end, which wasn't ideal, but we just had to live with that. And the other actors, Eric Banner, Tony Collette, we sort of got them in sort of midway and towards the end as well. So in a way, what we did was unconventional. A lot of animators wouldn't like to work that way, but for us, the fact that we had these big names meant that we had to be a little bit more flexible and get them in when we could. In Mary Max we had over 200 characters, and every one of those characters I chose to design myself. For the lead characters they got a much more polished character drawing, but for the lesser characters like the Blowfly and Albert in the background, a lot of the time it would be just a quick pencil sketch that I would then give to the sculptors to work from. And someone said if I'd have made the entire film myself, it would have taken 235 years. So the reality was I had to get sculptors to learn how to sculpt in my style. And that was really difficult. That was a real challenge. I'd never articulated before what my style was. So we came up with a style Bible. And that was this very thick document that articulated what my style was. And we soon discovered that my style was chunky wonky. Everything in the film had a chunky wonky look to it. There were no straight lines. Every prop had to look like it had been dropped once. Every prop had to look like it had been bought at an op shop. And then everything had to be grunged up and aged. My aesthetic's very organic. We had about 4 or 5 sculptors. The two lead sculptors were Darren Bell and a guy called Caleb Nutt, and then another guy, Darcy, came in halfway through, and they would just sit there in this room sculpting all day. Once it was sculpted, it then went off to the mould making room, and a mould would be made of it. And depending on what the puppet had to do, sometimes it would be a very basic mould, but other times the puppet would need a very complex armature. And an armature is a steel skeleton which sits inside the puppet, which keeps it rigid and means that the puppet can be manipulated into any shape without its arm or legs dropping. It would almost be in a frozen movement. In animation, there's 24 frames per second. So if a character waves their hand and you see that on screen for a second, it means we have to move the character's hand 24 times. So basically, you move the character's hand, take a photograph, move it again, take another photograph, do that 24 times, and you have 1 second of animation, which is why animation is so slow and so expensive. Each one of our animators did about 5 seconds on average per day. So over a week, we would only shoot 2.5 minutes, which is why the shoot went for so long. With Einstein in the background, he was for a photograph that appeared in the film of Albert Einstein. And we could have just got a photograph of Albert Einstein and put in a frame, but we thought, no, every character has to look like it was, it exists in this world. So our sculptor, I think he spent about a week just sculpting that little Albert Einstein for one 3-second shot in the film. So some puppets got a lot more attention than they deserved, but we always had to work out, well, if that character's only on screen for a couple of seconds, we can only afford to spend a week on that puppet. All my films are about characters who are considered outsiders or marginalised or underdogs. And the reason I write about these characters is it goes back to my childhood. And in the playground, I would tend to befriend all the kids who were teased or bullied or seen as strange or weird. And I don't know why, but I had a huge amount of empathy for these people. And that's a word I use a lot. I couldn't understand why these kids were being teased and misunderstood. And so all these years later, that's manifested in my writing. My writing is about trying to educate, without being preachy or getting on my soapbox, but trying to educate the audience and get them to understand what it's like to have Asperger's syndrome, what it's like to have Tourette's, what it's like to have Alzheimer's, and really put themselves in my character's shoes. In a way, people say comedy is the hardest thing to do, and in a way for me, comedy is the easiest thing to do. The hardest thing to do is to get an audience to totally fall in love with your character and be moved and be fighting for them, be on their side and really empathise with them, and I find that incredibly challenging. I always say that, I always pretend that when an audience are watching my film, they're each sitting in a little compost heap, and by the end of the film they leave the cinema feeling nourished, that they've absorbed everything they've seen, and that they leave the cinema feeling like I haven't wasted their time, that now everything's a little bit clearer. But I really respect and acknowledge the power of cinema and the power to really have an effect on people. There's no better moment for me than seeing an audience come out of the cinema with red eyes and tissues and knowing that I've made them cry. And for me, that's the most happy experience I can have, is to know that I've made 300 people cry. That sounds a bit sadistic, but that's my aim as a writer, essentially, and as a director. So yeah, filmmaking is a very powerful experience, and you really have to respect the control that you can have over an audience.